The gleaming conference room on the 42nd floor of Pinnacle Global Consulting buzzed with nervous energy as 12 candidates waited for their final interviews. The position was Senior Director of International Markets, a role that would oversee the company's expansion into emerging economies across 3 continents. It was the kind of job that could define a career, with a salary package that included stock options worth potentially millions. Elena Vasquez sat quietly in the corner, reviewing her notes one final time. At 34, she had spent the last decade building an impressive resume, working for international development organizations across Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Her experience included negotiating trade agreements in Bolivia, managing infrastructure projects in Nigeria, and coordinating disaster relief efforts in the Philippines. But as she listened to the other candidates discussing their credentials, she felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. The other candidates were exactly what she had expected to find at a company like Pinnacle Global. They wore expensive suits, carried leather briefcases, and spoke in the polished tones of elite business schools. Most had MBA degrees from Ivy League universities, and their conversation was peppered with references to previous positions at Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, and other prestigious firms. "I just finished a 3-year stint running emerging markets for Deutsche Bank," said Bradley Morrison, a tall man in his late 30s who seemed to command attention whenever he spoke. "Before that, I was with JP Morgan's Latin American division. The experience really prepared me for the complexities of international finance." "That's impressive," replied Catherine Wells, an elegant woman who had been discussing her Harvard MBA and her work with a major consulting firm in Singapore. "I spent 2 years in Asia developing market entry strategies for Fortune 500 companies. The cultural challenges are significant, but nothing that can't be overcome with the right analytical framework." Elena listened to their conversations and felt increasingly out of place. While they talked about boardrooms and client presentations, her experience had been in rural villages and refugee camps. While they discussed profit margins and market penetration strategies, she had focused on sustainable development and community empowerment. She began to wonder if she had made a mistake applying for this position. The receptionist, a young woman named Ashley, called out names one by one as candidates were summoned for their interviews. Each person who returned from the conference room looked either confident or defeated, but none volunteered information about how their interviews had gone. The tension in the waiting room grew thicker with each passing hour. "Elena Vasquez?" Ashley called out, mispronouncing both the first and last name despite having Elena's resume with the correct pronunciation clearly marked. Elena gathered her materials and followed Ashley down a hallway lined with photographs of the company's various international offices. The images showed gleaming skyscrapers in London, modern office complexes in Tokyo, and contemporary buildings in Sao Paulo. Everything looked expensive, corporate, and intimidating. The conference room contained 5 people seated around a polished granite table. At the head sat Richard Pemberton, the CEO of Pinnacle Global, a man in his 50s whose silver hair and perfectly tailored suit projected an aura of wealth and authority. To his right was Margaret Chen, the Chief Operating Officer, and to his left sat James Rodriguez, the current head of international markets, who would be Elena's boss if she got the position. "Please, have a seat," Richard said, gesturing to the chair across from him. As Elena sat down and introduced herself, she noticed his slight smirk when she spoke. Her English was fluent and grammatically perfect, but she had never been able to completely eliminate the accent that revealed her roots in a small town in rural Mexico. "So, Elena," Richard began, glancing at her resume, "I see you've spent most of your career working for nonprofit organizations and NGOs. That's certainly interesting." His tone suggested that he found it anything but interesting. "Tell us why you think that experience would translate to the corporate world." Elena had prepared for this question, knowing that her unconventional background would be seen as a weakness rather than a strength. "My work with international development organizations has given me deep experience in emerging markets that most corporate consultants only understand from statistical reports," she began. "I've lived and worked in 12 different countries, managing budgets, negotiating with government officials, and building sustainable business relationships in challenging environments." "That's all very admirable," Richard interrupted, his smirk becoming more pronounced as Elena's accent became more noticeable when she was nervous. "But we're looking for someone who can work with serious business clients, someone who can represent our company in boardrooms with Fortune 500 executives. Our clients expect a certain level of sophistication." The implication was clear, and Elena felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. Richard was suggesting that her accent made her unsuitable for high-level business interactions, that her background somehow made her less professional or capable than the other candidates. Margaret Chen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly recognizing the inappropriate nature of Richard's comments, but she remained silent. James Rodriguez looked down at his notes, avoiding eye contact. The other executives seemed to be waiting for Elena to respond to what was essentially a challenge to her qualifications based on her ethnicity and accent. "I understand your concerns about client interactions," Elena said carefully, working to keep her voice steady. "Perhaps I could address them by sharing some specific examples of my experience working with international business leaders and government officials." "By all means," Richard said, leaning back in his chair with an expression that suggested he was humoring her rather than genuinely interested in what she had to say. Elena took a deep breath and made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire interview. Instead of continuing to defend herself in English, she switched to perfect, unaccented French. "Monsieur Pemberton, si vous préférez, nous pouvons continuer cette conversation en français. J'ai travaillé étroitement avec les dirigeants d'Air France et de Total lors de leurs expansions en Afrique de l'Ouest. Mon accent espagnol disparaît complètement quand je parle français, comme vous pouvez l'entendre." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Richard's smirk disappeared completely, replaced by a look of surprise and confusion. Margaret Chen sat up straighter, her eyes widening with interest. James Rodriguez looked up from his notes with a completely different expression than he had worn moments before. "You speak French," Richard said, stating the obvious as he struggled to process what had just happened. "Couramment," Elena replied, which meant fluently, before switching to German. "Aber wenn Sie Deutsch bevorzugen, können wir auch auf Deutsch sprechen. Ich habe 3 Jahre in Berlin verbracht und MIT Siemens und BMW an Projekten in Osteuropa gearbeitet. Meine Deutschkenntnisse sind ebenfalls fließend." The room fell completely silent. Elena had just demonstrated fluent German with perfect pronunciation and sophisticated vocabulary. The woman they had been dismissing based on her Spanish accent was revealing herself to be remarkably multilingual. Or perhaps Portuguese would be more appropriate, Elena continued, switching languages again. "Trabalhei extensivamente no Brasil com a Petrobras e o Banco do Brasil. Morei no Rio de Janeiro por 2 anos, desenvolvendo estratégias de mercado para empresas americanas que queriam expandir na América do Sul." Margaret Chen leaned forward, completely engaged now. "How many languages do you speak?" Elena smiled for the first time since entering the room. 6 fluently, 3 conversationally. "Would you like me to demonstrate Arabic?" "I spent 2 years in Morocco working on renewable energy projects." Without waiting for an answer, she switched to Arabic. "عملت مع الحكومة المغربية والبنك الإفريقي للتنمية في مشاريع الطاقة المتجددة. خبرتي في الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا واسعة جدا." The transformation in the room was complete. The executives who had been dismissive and condescending were now staring at Elena with something approaching awe. Richard Pemberton looked like he had been hit by a truck, his earlier arrogance replaced by obvious embarrassment. "And finally," Elena said, switching to Mandarin Chinese, "Tanju ju yusen yu ju ju asian, yusen ju 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 asian, wo hil fia samir rishan shu ju asian, sun tzu ju asian zu ju ju ju, ju asian sun tzu ju ju, ju 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 ju, zu ju ju ju." James Rodriguez was frantically taking notes now. "That was Mandarin Chinese. You speak Mandarin Chinese." "I lived in Beijing for 18 months, Elena replied in English, her confidence now fully restored. "I was coordinating a water infrastructure project that involved negotiations with the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, the Asian Development Bank, and several multinational corporations. The project required daily communication in Mandarin with government officials who spoke no English." Margaret Chen was the first to recover her composure. "Elena, this is remarkable. Your language skills are exactly what we need for our international expansion. Can you tell us more about your experience in specific markets?" "Certainly," Elena said, her earlier nervousness completely gone. "Let me start with Latin America, since that seems to be where you have concerns about my background." Her tone was professional, but carried a subtle edge that made it clear she hadn't forgotten Richard's earlier comments. "I've worked in Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile on projects ranging from microfinance initiatives to major infrastructure development. I've negotiated contracts with government ministries, managed relationships with local business leaders, and navigated the complex regulatory environments in each country. My work required understanding not just the languages, but the cultural nuances, political dynamics, and economic realities of each market. She turned to James Rodriguez. Your current Latin American strategy, based on the reports I've read, focuses heavily on Brazil and Mexico, while largely ignoring the Pacific Alliance countries. That's a significant oversight. Colombia, Peru, and Chile represent some of the fastest-growing economies in the region, with increasingly sophisticated business environments and strong ties to Asian markets. James looked impressed despite himself. You've analyzed our current strategy. I've read every public report and case study your company has published about international markets, Elena replied. It's clear that you're approaching emerging markets with a developed world mindset. You're looking for opportunities that resemble what you already know rather than understanding the unique advantages and challenges of each market. Richard finally found his voice. And I suppose you think you could do better? Elena looked directly at him, her eyes steady and confident. Mr. Pemberton, 3 hours ago you dismissed me because of my accent. You suggested that I wasn't sophisticated enough to represent your company to serious business clients. But in the last 10 minutes, I've demonstrated fluency in 6 languages and detailed knowledge of international markets across 4 continents. I've shown you analytical capabilities that surpass what I've seen in your published strategies, and I've done it all while maintaining perfect composure, despite your prejudicial comments. The silence in the room was deafening. Richard's face had turned red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, Elena couldn't tell. But she wasn't finished. You want to know if I can represent your company to Fortune 500 executives? Last month, I presented a market analysis to the board of directors of Royal Dutch Shell in both English and Dutch. The month before that, I briefed Toyota's executive committee in Tokyo about infrastructure challenges in Southeast Asia, conducting the entire presentation in Japanese. And 6 months ago, I negotiated a $50 million development agreement with the Nigerian government, switching between English, French, and Hausa, depending on which officials I was addressing. Margaret Chen was writing furiously now. Elena, those are exactly the kinds of client relationships we need to develop. Your experience is extraordinary. It's the kind of experience you can only get by actually living and working in these markets, Elena continued. Not by flying in for 3-day consulting visits and staying in international hotels. Not by analyzing markets from New York or London offices, but by understanding how business actually gets done in Lagos or Lima or Bangkok. She stood up from her chair, gathering her materials. Gentlemen, Miss Chen, I appreciate your time today. But I think it's clear that there's a fundamental mismatch between what your company says it values and what it actually values. You say you want international expertise, but you judge candidates based on their accents. You say you want emerging market experience, but you prefer candidates with traditional corporate backgrounds who have never actually lived in emerging markets. Richard looked panicked. Elena, wait, I think there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Elena replied calmly. You made your position quite clear when you suggested that my accent made me unsuitable for your clients. The fact that I happen to speak 6 languages doesn't change your fundamental attitude toward people like me. She walked toward the door, then turned back. For what it's worth, your current international strategy is going to fail. You're trying to export American business practices to markets that don't work like America. You're hiring people who look and sound like your existing executives instead of people who actually understand these markets. And you're missing opportunities in some of the fastest-growing economies in the world because you're too comfortable with what you already know. As Elena reached for the door handle, Margaret Chen spoke up. Elena, please don't leave. Richard, I think you owe Elena an apology, and we need to discuss a different kind of offer. Elena paused at the door, her hand on the handle. Miss Chen, with respect, an apology doesn't change anything. Mr. Pemberton revealed his true feelings about people with accents like mine. No amount of backtracking can undo that. You're absolutely right, Margaret said, standing up. And that's exactly why we need someone like you in a leadership position. Not just as a director, but as someone who can help us change our entire approach to international business. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but remained silent. James Rodriguez looked between Elena and Margaret, clearly sensing that the power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. What kind of position are you talking about? Elena asked, her hand still on the door handle. Vice President of Global Strategy, Margaret said without hesitation, a newly created position that would report directly to me. You would have authority over all international market development. with the budget and mandate to build the kind of team that can actually succeed in emerging markets. Elena turned around to face the room again. That's not the position I applied for. No, it's not. It's a much bigger position, with significantly more responsibility and compensation. Based on what you've shown us today, the director position would be a waste of your talents. Richard finally spoke up, his voice noticeably subdued. Elena, I owe you an apology. My comments about your accent were inappropriate and unprofessional. They don't reflect the values this company aspires to uphold. Elena studied his face, trying to determine if his apology was genuine or simply damage control. Mr. Pemberton, I appreciate the apology, but actions matter more than words. If you're serious about changing how this company approaches international business, then you need to be prepared for some uncomfortable truths about your current strategies and personnel. Such as? Margaret asked. Elena set her materials back down and remained standing. Such as the fact that your entire international team consists of people who have never lived outside North America or Western Europe for more than a few months. Such as the fact that your market analyses are based on data that's often years out of date and collected by researchers who don't speak the local languages. Such as the fact that you're consistently being outmaneuvered by smaller, more agile companies who understand these markets better than you do. She looked directly at Richard. And such as the fact that your leadership team has unconscious biases that prevent you from recognizing talent when it doesn't come in the package you expect. How many other qualified candidates have you dismissed because of their accents or their unconventional backgrounds, or their failure to fit your narrow definition of what a business executive should look and sound like? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Richard looked uncomfortable, but Margaret nodded approvingly. Those are exactly the kinds of issues we need someone to address, Margaret said. Elena, if we offered you the vice president position, what would be your first priority? Elena considered the question carefully. Building a team of people who actually understand the markets we're trying to enter. That means hiring people who speak the languages, who have lived in these countries, who understand the cultural and political dynamics. It means valuing linguistic diversity and international experience over traditional corporate credentials. And your second priority? Completely overhauling your market research methodology. You can't understand emerging markets by reading reports written by consultants who have never left Manhattan. You need researchers who can conduct interviews in local languages, who understand the informal networks that drive business in these countries, who can identify opportunities that don't show up in traditional data sources. James Rodriguez leaned forward. What about existing client relationships? How would you handle the transition? Very carefully, Elena replied. Change is always challenging. But your current approach isn't working. Your Latin American revenues have been flat for 3 years. Your African initiatives have failed to gain traction, and your Asian expansion has been limited to the most obvious markets. At some point, you have to decide whether you want to be comfortable or successful. Margaret and James exchanged glances. Elena, would you be willing to give us 24 hours to discuss this opportunity? We'd like to put together a formal offer for the vice president position. I'd be willing to consider it, Elena said. But I want to be clear about something. If I take this position, I will hire based on competence and experience, not on accents or traditional credentials. I will challenge strategies that aren't working, even if they were developed by senior executives. And I will expect the authority to make the changes necessary to actually succeed in international markets. Understood, Margaret said. We'll be in touch tomorrow. As Elena left the conference room, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Part of her was exhilarated by the unexpected turn the interview had taken, but another part of her was frustrated that it required such a dramatic demonstration to be taken seriously. How many other qualified people had been dismissed by companies like this because they didn't fit the expected mold? 24 hours later, Elena received a call from Margaret Chen with an offer that exceeded her expectations. The vice president position came with a salary that was nearly double what the director position had offered, along with stock options, a substantial budget for team building, and the authority to implement comprehensive changes to the company's international strategy. 6 months into her new role, Elena had built a team that spoke collectively over 20 languages and had deep experience across emerging markets. The company's international revenues had increased by 30%, and they had successfully entered 3 new markets that had previously been considered too challenging to pursue. Richard Pemberton, to his credit, had become one of Elena's strongest supporters once he recognized the results she was delivering. He publicly acknowledged that his initial reaction to her accent had been both wrong and counterproductive, and he used his own mistake as a teaching example in company diversity training programs. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Elena received an email from a young woman named Carmen Rodriguez, a recent college graduate who had been inspired by Elena's story to apply for international positions despite her own concerns about her accent. "I used to think my bilingual background was a disadvantage in corporate America," Carmen wrote. "Your success showed me that it could be my greatest asset instead." Elena smiled as she read the email, remembering her own fears and doubts just months earlier. She had learned that sometimes the characteristics that make others underestimate you are exactly the ones that can become your greatest strengths. Her accent hadn't disappeared, and she no longer wanted it to. It was part of who she was, and who she was had turned out to be exactly what the company needed. The end.